Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome for those who are joining us here in person and those who are also joining us on the webinar online. My name is Tarek El-Aris and I'm the chair of Middle Eastern Studies. And before I introduce our distinguished guest, I just want to thank our sponsors and all the people who made this event happen. Very grateful for the Dickey Center, for Tori Holt, Judith, John, everyone who's worked to do this. I'm very grateful for the government department, also Ben Valentino and all the students. And I'm very grateful for my colleague Azedine Fishir and co-host. And also thank you, Jennifer Thomas and MES, for all your work on this as well. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to Dartmouth Professor Melani Cammett. Melani Cammett is Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs in the Department of Government and Director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Cammett's books include Compassionate Communalism, Welfare and Sectarianism in Lebanon, 2014, which won the American Political Science Association Giovanni Sartori Book Award. It also includes A Political Economy of the Middle East, co-authored with Ishac Diwan. And from what I understand is that the talk today is going to be part of a chapter for a new edition of that book. Professor, there is also, many publications. The last one, a recent publication, is the Oxford Handbook on Politics in Muslim Societies, which came out from Oxford University Press in 2022, and it's co-authored with Pauline Jones. Her work is in a variety of fields, variety of areas, post-war intergroup relations, religion and politics, sectarianism in the Middle East, but also in Bosnia or in ex-Yugoslavia, identity politics and social welfare in Lebanon, my home country, and she has a new project also on toleration that is also dealing with Lebanon, but also in a global, more comparative context. And I also had the pleasure of working with Melani most recently as part of her being the head of the program committee at MESA, and I got to work with her and see how she brings people together, how she organizes us, and we went through this impossible task of coming up for a program for an entire Middle Eastern Studies convention in just a couple of days. It was really a heroic act, and it was also Melani's kind of leadership that made that possible. Melani, we're very happy that you were able to join us. Welcome to Dartmouth, and please help me welcoming Melani Cammett.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Can you all hear me? Okay, so the mic is working. And I'm really grateful to the co-sponsors, the Center for Middle East Studies, the government department, the Dickey Center for inviting me, Jennifer, for all your help. And it's really a pleasure to be in this idyllic place where you can forget that there's climate change and pandemics and economic stagnation and disasters. So it's really lovely to be here. I might not leave, actually. It's very nice. So yes, today I want to speak a little bit about some work. We're doing a new edition of this book, A Political Economy of the Middle East. Some of you may be familiar with this book. It was started years ago by Alan Richards and John Waterbury, and I took it over in the last edition with Ishac Diwan, who's an economist at the Paris School of Economics. We've also brought in Stephen Heidemann, who's a professor at Smith College, to co-author this with us. So we're writing a new edition, and one of the areas of focus of the book is sort of what's happening after the Arab uprisings. Where are things going? How are these so-called social contracts or social pacts evolving? And so that's what I want to start to get at today. And just to give you a little preview, so I want to very briefly say a few words about what things look like pre-uprisings in like 5 minutes, everything from roughly the 1950s until 2010. Those of you who were there yesterday evening in Professor Fischer's class may have some familiarity with some of these themes, but it'll be quick. And then I want to talk briefly about the Arab uprising, some of the themes there, because that's relevant to where things went afterwards. Talk a little bit about the evolution of post-uprising social pacts in different types of political economies in the region, and give a few examples along the way, and then try to think about how you deal with ongoing challenges in the region. I wish I had the answer. So far, I have not found anybody who has the answer. And it's not because people don't know what they're talking about. It's just a really vexing set of challenges. So some of you may be familiar with this term, the social contract, that is often thrown around to describe the nature of state-society relations and political economy formations in the Middle East after independence, roughly sometime in the 50s, 60s for most countries in the region. I generally prefer, following some other people, to use the term pacts, because I think contract implies a kind of relationship of equality between rulers and citizens that simply is not the case in much of this region. And you've probably, many of you heard of this term, the authoritarian bargain, to describe the nature of these pacts, which roughly refers to this set of arrangements whereby citizens and residents of Middle Eastern and North African countries forfeit voice in exchange for a set of social benefits. So that's the general picture, and that's how many people have characterized the region and the various different arrangements within the region after independence or the creation of the modern Middle Eastern states. Roughly speaking, the pillars of this quote-unquote authoritarian bargain involved some combination of public sector employment, which, as in many other developing countries, was a key foundation of welfare regimes in this region, and in some countries was guaranteed to those who had post-secondary educations. And it also involved subsidies on basic commodities and fuel, and social spending and investment in basic health and educational infrastructure and so forth. So those are kind of like the welfare regime foundations. These welfare regimes, by and large, did not look like what we think of as Western European welfare states with extensive pension programs or whatever it might be. And so just to give you a picture of what these post-independence regimes achieved, they actually brought about significant social mobility in the initial decades after independence. And I'm giving you sort of aggregates of the region, right? So here's a figure of infant mortality rates. So the lower, the better, less mortality. And this is global regions and some income aggregates of countries. And the main thing I want you to look at is the black line, which is the Middle East and North Africa. And you can see that it starts up at the very top in 1960 and goes down and has the steepest decline of all global regions. And often infant mortality is a bellwether of public health infrastructure, right? It's like a good basic measure indicating how effective your basic public health infrastructure is, among other indicators. So things were, really improving in the initial decades after independence, and that had real tangible effects on people's lives, as you can imagine. And it also arguably raised expectations. And this was due to a lot of public investment. And here's a figure that Stephen Heidemann, my co-author on the book, pulled out of a World Bank publication, which looks at poverty rates at this threshold, 320 a day. And basically, this is kind of a nice middle level indicator that's appropriate for middle income countries, not the poorest of the poor countries. And that makes sense for the Middle East because this is on average a middle income region. And you can see that the Middle East, which is the green line, had pretty low poverty rates when measured at this threshold, and of course even lower at other thresholds. And until this uptick here, which we will get to, and notice that is probably the only region here that is experiencing that uptick in the last 8 years or so. So before the last 8 years, which we're going to spend most of today talking about, things were actually relatively good. And we can talk about why that might have been the case, but definitely public investment had a lot to do with it. And the last thing I want to show you about the sort of pre-uprising period is this figure which really captures the public sector expenditures on things like public employment and investment in infrastructure and stuff like that. That's what this indicator captures. And the two lines here represent 1975 and 2005. And so 1975, we're still kind of in the golden age of post-independence social mobility in the region. And you can see that the extent of public investment is really high in the Middle East, North Africa, which is the far left set of bars, and much higher than other regions, including OECD, higher than OECD countries. But look at the pattern here to 2005. It's the only region that flips. So that is really a shock to the system, right? Imagine that you have all this public investment driving positive change, and all of a sudden it flips. So that's where we are in the 5 years leading up to the uprisings. Last thing is, this is another, I think this really captures a lot. This is worker share of GDP, okay? And so what you have is the Middle East and North Africa, where you can see in the years leading up to the uprisings, a real decline in the share of GDP that workers have. So even if growth rates were rising, which was the case in a number of the uprising countries like Egypt or Tunisia, you're seeing serious distributional issues. Okay, uprisings. I will not spend time talking about the causes and motivations for the uprisings. Have been sort of like mini cottage industry debates, like, was it dignity? Was it social grievances? Was it economic demands? Was it democracy? I think, all of the above, right? And also how you disentangle those things is really difficult. And what people mean by these things, I think, is really partly the work of anthropologists to decipher. But these were all demands of the protesters that came out in the streets across the region. Of course, starting in Tunisia, spreading to Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing I want to point out, this is from an article that I published with Ishac Diwan and Irina Vartanova, in which we look at the relationship between perceptions of economic security and people's preferences for democracy as a political system. And basically the punchline of this here is you have economic security. As you feel more economically secure, you go this way on the x-axis, and you have here commitment to democracy on the y-axis. And basically people feel more committed to democracy when they feel more economically secure. And if we were to dig into all these points on the scatter plot, you would see that Egypt and Tunisia, for example, move around with Egyptians feeling more sanguine about democracy when they feel more economically secure, and less sanguine. So disentangling what people want, I think, is complicated because what they want evolves depending on how they perceive their lived experiences. And I think if anyone is going to argue that Arabs are anti-democratic, they just need to look at this figure and realize that it's very contingent, as it is for many people across the world, on how you feel about your lived experience and how you experience quote-unquote democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So where are we now? How have things evolved in the post-uprising period? You had people coming out on the streets demanding more of the pie, more dignity, and so forth. So how did governments respond? And it's, we're trying to piece together a picture of this, which is sometimes challenging because this is a data poor region. And some of the reasons why it's data poor are probably linked to authoritarianism, because authoritarian rulers don't like to release data, or they like to mess with the data, or certain things are not on the books in their budgets. So it's really hard to get data under those circumstances. So we're doing the best we can with what we have. But the first point I want to make is that we have in this region, not one region, but at least 3, or if not 4 types of political economies. And that's how we're thinking about it. And here I've put up some cute little pictures to kind of capture what I mean by this. The top being one of the kind of mega projects in the Gulf. And so you have this very wealthy Gulf region. Many of the countries in this region have high oil and natural gas reserves and are not facing the same kind of fiscal constraints that other economies are facing. So they're off in one land post-uprisings that's quite different from other experiences. And so the second picture here is a picture from Yemen. I'm sure you're all aware of the war in Yemen, and that Yemen has been described as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, which is really something because we have a lot of very, very serious humanitarian crises in the world. So you have a number of countries that are really conflict affected, to put it mildly. Yemen being one of them, Syria, Sudan, that are really sort of bombed to the Stone Ages in some places and have experienced major regression in well-being, and we'll talk about that shortly. And then you have this middle group of countries, and this is where a lot of the original uprising countries lie, like Tunisia, Egypt. They're not the poorest of the poor, but they don't have the fiscal capacity of these Gulf countries with all of their resources, and they have larger populations and so forth, and they're really in a difficult equilibrium. So I'm going to spend probably a little bit more time talking about those countries and the case of Egypt in particular. So 3 very different patterns. You also have what we call the OECD countries in our book, Israel and Turkey, which are in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and are kind of in a different development path. Although things have been changing, particularly politically in both countries, but economically really palpably in the case of Turkey. So we divide in our work here the region into these different political economies, and we've gone back and forth on typologies. I know some of the students read a chapter from a previous version where we had this really complicated alphabet soup of acronyms to describe these different political economies. Now we're just stripping it down to the bare bones and going with GDP per capita, which is very reductionist, and we are not trying to argue that GDP per capita explains everything. That is not true whatsoever. But it does have some meaning in that it allows you to think about the kind of space that you have, the fiscal space that you have. And GDP per capita is correlated with a lot of things. We tried out different typologies for a while. We were going to have a category called the conflict countries, but the fact of the matter is they're all in low income anyway, not coincidentally. And then how do you start, categorizing some of these other countries? Do you call Lebanon or Iraq a conflict country? It gets very murky. So we're going with GDP per capita for now, despite the reductionism of that typology. And you can see that there's wide variation in GDP per capita in this region. To the left, you have those Gulf countries with high GDP per capita. Qatar is really quite up there, and even within the Gulf countries, there's the super rich ones and the less rich ones. So there's that, and then all the way on the right, you have the OECD countries, Israel and Turkey, and then in the middle, you have quite a stark difference with these middle-income countries and low-income countries. So that's the way I want to talk about it. And I basically want to take you through, I promise I will try not to bore you to death with these figures, but I think they tell a story. And this is what we've been working on, trying to gather whatever data is available. So I want to try to tell a story of these three types of political economies and then talk a little bit about some concrete examples. And so here we have some aggregate indicators for these different types of political economies: the high income, the low income, the middle income, and the OECD. And this is, again, a measure of public employment and infrastructure. It's an indicator that roughly captures how much is, available, how much the state is investing. And again, I mentioned previously that public employment was a really important component of the post-independence welfare regimes in these countries. And that was the sort of aspiration, was to get to a public sector job. So if you start decreasing your public sector, that has implications for the well-being of your population and for this middle class that you created. And basically what you see here is that the low-income political economies have just plummeted in the last number of years in terms of public employment, and there's higher rates in the other types of political economies, but those middle income ones represented by the green dotted line have had a dip. And that's part of the story of those middle income economies is after the uprisings, you saw something of a spike in public expenditures for political reasons. Egypt was trying to funnel more into the public sector. Tunisia, certainly there were accusations that the Islamist Ennahda government was stuffing the bureaucracy with its supporters when it was in power. The Gulf countries, you guys have probably heard the famous, billions that the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris were throwing at their populations. So that's reflected in this sort of spike that we see. But there's a real divergence here. I mean, this is like living in another land from those other places. Here we have a graph I took from a publication by two economists that really looks at public sector jobs. They calculated this data from the ILO. And without going through each and every case, you can see that there is a kind of spike, an increase in public sector jobs in some places, which is clearly related to politics after the uprisings. A lot of these regimes were absolutely terrified that even if they didn't experience mass uprisings themselves, that it was coming next to them. So public sector jobs were one way, even though the international financial institutions had been telling them, you've got to cut the public sector, you've got to cut the public sector, they kept filling up those public sector jobs for security reasons. Egypt here, it's hard to see with all these lines, but Egypt is kind of experiencing a gradual decline here. And I think the story of Egypt is very interesting. I want to get into that in a little bit of detail. Subsidies. I mentioned that subsidies were a really important component of welfare regimes. So this is fuel subsidies as a percentage of GDP. Fuel is one of the key commodities that was subsidized in these countries. And you can see that in that green dashed line, that's the middle income countries, you see a real decline here. This is 2015, so this is the most recent data we have, 2015 onward. Kind of flat in the high income countries after coming down a bit, and sort of more stable in general with some spike. I think that's Sudan that's representing that spike in the low-income countries at the bottom there. But basically, it's a story of decline in subsidies, which is probably a smart thing to do on some level, provided you can make up for them in other ways, because subsidies are very regressive, particularly on fuel. They tend to benefit wealthier or upper-income groups more than the poor. And yet they're, a large ticket item on budgets. But it's hard. Think about it. If you have something already as an entitlement, it's extremely hard to take it away. Just think about Obamacare, and there were all these town hall meetings with people that were anti-Obama, and they were telling, Democrats, get off of my medical insurance, not realizing that it was a state entitlement, right? So even people who are, avowedly ideologically opposed to these handouts will, with much reluctance, think about getting rid of them. So it's hard to get rid of these things. This is health expenditure as a percentage of GDP, and I'm just focusing here on these last years. Health expenditure, social expenditures in general, in the upper and middle income countries have not been cut drastically. It doesn't mean that you are getting great things for your investment here, but it's really these low income countries that are just falling off a cliff. And there are some exceptions. I mean, these are aggregates of groups of countries. So if you've spent any time in Lebanon, you will see that the health infrastructure is crumbling, and that's reflected in the numbers. I have personally experienced this. We were talking about this yesterday, having returned from Lebanon, multiple trips this year with various parasites and other wonderful bacteria and things like that, because the public welfare infrastructure, the public health, sanitation infrastructure is literally crumbling. So there are some exceptions in that middle income category, Lebanon being a real case in point. But this is, particularly difficult for poor people who rely on public services more. The wealthy, more and more you see a trend in the Middle East and North Africa towards private services, and anyone who can afford it is trying to go to the private sector for services, whether it's health or education. But the poor don't have that choice, and if you're in a country like Lebanon, where suddenly there's been a huge spike because of this massive economic crisis since 2019 in the poor, more and more people are going to crumbling public welfare infrastructure. And just a few more of these slides. You can see some of the effects of these changes in social outcomes even already. And so these are immunization rates, and immunizations are generally one of the easier services to deliver. And often international organizations will get involved in that in the poorest countries. And you see in these low income countries a drop, and even starting in the middle income countries, you see a drop in immunization rates. So that's really telling you something when immunization rates are dropping. And it's not because we have like hordes of anti-vaxxers running around, although those people do exist. And we ran some surveys in Lebanon recently, and it's surprising how many people were resistant. But at any rate, so you see that decline there. Educational outcomes are starting to dip, and here we have school enrollments. This is secondary school enrollments, which is an important indicator. In middle income countries, virtually everyone is in primary school, so that's not really a useful indicator, but secondary school is more meaningful. And you're starting to see declines in secondary school enrollments certainly in the low income countries, and many of which are conflict affected. So schools have been blown up and blasted away. And, we talk about children, that are a lost generation in Syria and elsewhere. So that is part of the story, but also in middle income countries. And that's, a big change. And think back to what I was telling you about those decades after independence, where the state really invested and people experienced real social mobility. So finally, we're seeing changes in human development. Generally, the world is on an upward trend, but a real regression in low-income countries and starting to be visible in middle-income countries as well. This is the UN Human Development Index, which captures a whole bunch of things like poverty rates and access to basic services and income and so forth. It's like a composite index. So that is really striking, the decline in human development. Here's the thing. So we're seeing a dip in what states are providing for their people and the well-being of people. So the carrots, the so-called goodies that states were giving to people as part of that authoritarian bargain, are going down, and the sticks are going up. And so repression is on the rise, and that seems to be the way a number of countries are dealing with this situation. They're altering the mix of carrots and sticks and boosting the sticks. So this is an indicator from the Varieties of Democracy data set that measures the repression of civil society organizations. It's a proxy that people have used to try to capture repression. It's not a perfect indicator. This is a data set that's based on expert surveys, so we can talk about the problems of expert surveys. But by and large, I think this does a pretty good job of giving us a picture of what's going on across these different political economies. And as you go down, it's more repression. And you can see the trend lines are going down, and they're actually going down in a number of places. This is not just a low income, middle income story. So low income for sure. There's a dip. I was looking into which countries are explaining this rise here, this improvement. It's largely Sudan here. I mean, there's only a few countries in the low income. Then you have high income countries, which are mostly those Gulf countries, which are obviously very authoritarian and have become even more authoritarian and more repressive of civil society organizations. You have the green line, which is the middle income countries, and look, you see that rise right after the Arab uprisings, right? So there are these moments of freedom and space, relative freedom and space in Egypt and Tunisia and so forth, but coming back down again. And then you have even the OECD economies getting more repressive as well. And a lot of this is driven by changes happening in Turkey. That you see in these years here. So this is happening across the board, rising repression. And so what we have here is a story of declining social benefits, particularly in lower and to some degree middle income countries, and rising repression. And that seems to be the sort of bumper sticker story of the post-uprisings, despite the demands for dignity, redistribution, and so forth. So I just want to talk briefly about a few concrete examples from each of these categories. And I'll very briefly touch on the high income and the low income cases, and then spend a couple of minutes on the case of Egypt. This is a sort of promotional graphic for Vision 2030, which, if you haven't heard of it, is the Saudi plan to really diversify and jumpstart the economy. And there's just a ton of money going into this. Aramco, the state oil company, privatized, and a lot of those funds go into this public investment fund, which is really driving Vision 2030. And there's just enormous, ambitious plans here. I've actually been having conversations over the last 2 days with a number of you about this. Do we really think this is working? And I've been talking to colleagues who study this closely. And at this point in the record, and of course we're not at 2030 yet, so miracles might happen, but at this point it seems like there have been some successes, but there's a long way to go. So on the positive side, if we take a comprehensive view of transformation of society and economy, there definitely have been increases in female labor force participation, in education for women. If you've been following the news about Saudi, major changes in social life, cultural life. The morality police are repressed. People are going to concerts and dancing. Apparently there are bars being built in hotels now. So there's like major social changes going on that are being driven from the top down. We were talking about this earlier. If you are a civil society activist and you are demanding those changes, you get thrown in prison. But those changes can come from top down and occur. So there's some changes. There are some efforts to diversify the economy. But there's so far the targets for private investment have not been hit. And basically the story with all of these economies that have had such high legacies of public investment in their economies is that in order for them to grow, they have to replace declining public investment with rising private investment. That's just, there's no two ways about that. And benchmarking from 2017, the last I read from numbers of 2022, the private investment is actually lower than it was in Saudi Arabia now than it was in 2017. So this is not going in the right direction right now, but there's still time. There's a lot of kind of mega projects. We were talking about Neom, the city in the desert that's being built, and a number of people have expressed skepticism about the value for your money of building these cities in the desert and whether that's the best way to approach things. So this is kind of the strategy for the Saudis. Other countries in the Gulf, like the Emirates, for example, are more diversified already in services, but they're smaller populations. It's an easier, it's not easy, but it's easier to transform an economy like that than it is to transform the large Saudi economy. Then you have these countries like Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and now parts of Iraq, and let's see where Lebanon is going. And they are really, in very bad shape. And Yemen was always in the low income category, although it spiked up in the 90s after oil was discovered. But Syria was, a solidly middle income country with high development achievements, highly educated population, healthy workforce, et cetera, et cetera. And so to witness the decline you're seeing in Syria is quite astounding. And a number of organizations have come out with reports entitled things like the lost generation. And it quite literally is a lost generation, millions of people displaced outside of the country, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to tell you all the numbers, you know the story, but these are really going in a very different direction. It's very hard to see how you can approach development in these countries, and there's so much reconstruction, humanitarian aid that is required. So then when we turn to these middle-income countries, which is where a lot of the region lies, including Egypt, the sort of bellwether country, as some people call it, you are in a really difficult equilibrium here. So I just want to briefly sketch this out. Egypt is not in this figure because this is data from Eurobarometer in a recent wave, and Egypt did not participate in this survey, which was probably related to increasing repression in the country. But basically, this is a question about what people think is the most important challenge facing their country. And by and large, it's the economic situation, which is the red bar. In Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, everybody thinks it's the economy. That's really the big challenge. Coronavirus, look at the coronavirus. Nobody cares about the coronavirus. I remember talking about this with colleagues during the height of the coronavirus in Lebanon, and they were like, are you kidding me? The coronavirus is the least of our problems. I wish we were only dealing with the coronavirus. Economics are at the forefront of everyone's mind. And like I said, you really need to transform these economies to have more dynamic private sectors. And people have known this for years. People have been writing books about the problem with private sector development in the Middle East for decades, since I was in graduate school, at least, if not earlier. And what's been interesting since the uprisings and the availability of more data is a number of economists at the World Bank and my colleague Ishac Diwan and his colleagues have been using data to actually quantify the effects of cronyism on economic performance. And so they have shown with all kinds of data, like credit data, stock market data, all kinds of other data, that connected firms that were close to ruling elites like Mubarak in Egypt or Ben Ali in Tunisia, those firms generated fewer jobs, gobbled up more credit from banks, and had lower productivity rates. So there's actually a cost to cronyism. This is not like, as we were talking about yesterday, South Korean cronyism, which somehow managed to drive development. This is not the way cronyism has played out in this region, and that's very challenging. And it's really visible in the middle-income countries. This is really the issue for the middle-income countries in particular, because while there is cronyism in the Gulf, it's not having the same effect they have more space to play with diversification and so forth in the Gulf. So this is just looking at Egypt in particular. The punchline here is that the private sector is not really stepping up to the plate. This bottom line is investment as a percentage of GDP, which is pretty low when you compare it to middle income countries in general. And then at the top, the red line is public investment as a percentage of total investment. And public investment is really driving things still, and this might even be underreporting it. So that's a problem, because if you have to, these are inefficient, this is inefficient allocation of resources. And yet, people still want public sector jobs above all. So there's a colleague at the London School of Economics, Stefan Hertog, who's been writing about dual labor markets in the Middle East, which is really a characteristic of the region. And he argues it's more prominent in the Middle East and North Africa than other global regions, where you have these labor market insiders that generally have public sector jobs that come with security. You can't fire these people. They have benefits, kind of like having tenure. So hopefully we're more productive. So you can't fire these people. And so he looks at wages in different components of the labor market and finds that when you benchmark private sector jobs that are in the formal sector with Social Security, which are few and far between, those are less attractive in most countries, Egypt being the case I've circled here, than public sector jobs. So people are getting lower wages and benefits in private sector jobs. And over half the population is working in the informal sector, which is the biggest generator of jobs, but the most insecure and precarious, and of course the far less lucrative than public sector jobs. So you'd be crazy if you were in Egypt and didn't want a public sector job. You would be downright irrational. And that's because the private sector is not stepping up and creating jobs. And so, sometimes we hear in Middle East politics, political economy, that, the Arab region, they're just so used to handouts. They have to start, really picking themselves up by the britches, but they're actually being quite rational if this is the labor market setup that you're facing. Until you offer a different prospect, I think it's hard to expect people to aspire to a private sector job. And so in general, what we're seeing in Egypt is, I forgot to put the indicator here, but this is basically investment in health and education. And in the case of Egypt, unlike some other Middle Eastern countries, you're actually seeing declining investment in social sectors. And the red line is middle income countries globally. So when you benchmark Egypt against middle income countries, it's lower investment in social sectors. And one might argue that this is a policy choice, because there is a lot of investment going into high profile mega projects like the new administrative capital and others. This is actually a clip from a YouTube video featuring the 10 hot mega projects in Egypt. So there's a choice going on here. And I was just reading today a short piece in the Carnegie newsletter on the Middle East about the budget in Egypt and how there are these sort of elements of the budget that are off budget that give slush funds to the authorities to play with. So budgets reflect choices and priorities. This is clearly a choice in where the country is going. So this is post-uprising Egypt, where you have millions of people on the streets demanding change, and there is less investment in social sectors and rising poverty as well. So there's really been a palpable rise in poverty in Egypt over time. This is not unique to Egypt, but certainly it's quite visible in Egypt. There's also a lot of evidence that inequality is rising, even though the numbers are kind of hard to disentangle. And so how is the state dealing with rising poverty? Generally speaking, it's through these targeted programs. So what you see are these conditional cash transfer programs introduced in 2015, I believe, targeting house children in exchange for sending your kids to school or regular health checkups. You get a cash transfer, and a lot of these go to female-headed households. This is great. It's good that these exist, because if they didn't exist, we'd be in real trouble. And there's also another cash transfer program that goes to older Egyptians and the disabled and so forth. And there's been more programs added of this nature, but very targeted. There is this sort of general lack of investment in public infrastructure, health, education, and so forth, but this rise in targeted programs and a story of rising repression. So if we get back to that mix of carrots and sticks, the Egyptian path seems to be very much a story of declining social investment, rising poverty, targeted efforts to address the poverty with World Bank support and the backing of international donors, and very palpable rising repression. You really have not seen these levels of repression in decades upon decades upon decades, certainly not under Mubarak even, who's the dictator who was overthrown by the uprisings. So really serious repression facing the population, and I think that story is probably well known. And so where are we going? What's going to happen? What do we do about all of this? I mean, it's really a big challenge, as I said at the outset. I mean, one thing that seems clear to me is we're just going to have ongoing uprisings. And this started again in 2019. Okay, not Tunisia, Egypt. Repression levels are really high in Egypt and other places. But it's sort of popping up in other places, in Sudan, in Algeria, in Iraq, in Lebanon. So the region is experiencing more rounds. And so I'm not a subscriber of this phrase Arab winters that some people use, because I think it presumes that, revolution happens and it's done, and that's not the historical record. So I think we're going to just see chronic uprisings. Who knows what the result of those uprisings will be, but certainly that's part of the story to come for sure. It's not over. Immigration. I mean, really, this is a major priority. This is, again, from the Arab Barometer and the percentage of respondents, young people who've thought about immigrating. And so, you have a lot of people from the Middle East that really want to emigrate. In Lebanon, it's like, I don't know, what is that, 60, 70, 65, 70%. I mean, it's a lot of people. And anybody who can get out is basically going. And that's really horrific for the long-term development of these countries, because you have, of course, more educated people, leaving in general. There's massive brain drain, which compounds the development challenges. What do we do about this? Again, I don't have magic answers. I have thoughts. Doesn't mean that anyone in a position of power in the Middle East is going to listen to me. But we know, for decades, we've known what the proximate causes are of these problems. And I've been sort of telling you about them. The private sector, lack of dynamism, overinvestment in public sectors that are unproductive, inefficient or ineffective low-quality education systems, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole variety of factors that economists report on over and over. There's a series of general prescriptions that have been elaborated over and over, related to opening up markets, to real competition, not cronyism, improving the educational system and vocational training, creating better jobs. I could go on and on. It's not, terribly exciting to go through these technical policies, which are what most of the solutions are that we hear, business incubators, vocational training, and so forth. But I think what's very clear is that these technical policies are not going to work unless deeper issues are addressed. And so this is, just a lot of emphasis we hear on jobs and training and education and so forth. And so if you give better training, is it going to solve the problem? Well, this figure from a UN report suggests no, because you have a ton of new entrants. This is Egypt on the bottom here as an example. A ton of new entrants coming out every year on labor markets, new grads with post-secondary degrees, and this is jobs that are created. So there's, you can keep training people until kingdom come, but if there aren't the jobs to put them in, you're gonna have a problem and a recipe for more and more frustration. And that's the thing. And a number of economists who study this region say it's not a jobs problem, it's a good jobs problem. There's a ton of jobs getting created in Egypt and other countries, but they're all in the informal sector, without security, very low wages, and so forth. So this is not solving the problem. So what you really have is a series of dilemmas here. Growth doesn't necessarily lead to employment. I mean, I'm not going to go through this figure here, but basically the punchline is you have low youth labor force participation rates. So growth is not leading to employment. There was growth leading up to the Arab uprisings, but it's distributional issues that are the main concern. And the politics are really where the problem lie, the problems lie. And so you have, the polite term is policy feedback effects. When constituents get an entitlement, they don't want to give it up. And so you create, let's say you create a policy like Medicare, for example, you thereby create a constituency for that policy, and it's going to be really hard to roll back Medicare because people don't want to give it up. Well, you can think of it in those terms here as well. So elites are benefiting disproportionately. One thing we've really learned from the crony capitalism literature is well-connected people are benefiting disproportionately from these political economies, and they don't want to give that up. And then you have, at the mass level, these labor market insiders that people like Stefan Hertog have been writing about that don't want to give up their jobs and their public sector positions. And so there's a lot of entrenched opposition. What this looks like precisely varies from country to country. If you know the case of Lebanon, for example, there's a whole bunch of political leaders, many of whom came out of the Civil War, and were warlords during the Civil War and now are holding government positions for decades and decades since the end of the war in 1990. And they fight with each other periodically, but they all stop fighting instantaneously if you talk about dismantling the system, because they all have a vested interest in preserving the system. So it's very hard politically to make change, and the bottom line is the technical changes are not going to fix these problems. We're just going to keep seeing this chronic social mobilization, and if you tinker at the edges with this vocational training program or that big business incubator or whatever it might be, it's going to have no impact. You need a fundamental rewriting of the rules of the game, new political settlements with rulers who are prepared to allow actual competition in access to economic opportunities, who are prepared to invest in a rather non-discretionary way in building social sectors like health infrastructure or educational infrastructure, in regulating economies and markets and so forth in a relatively impartial way. And that's incredibly politically risky. So I'm ending on a horrifically negative note, but I just don't see how you can have in this middle income set of countries where you're facing this very low equilibrium, any kind of real change unless you have a fundamental revision of the underlying political settlements. And that may come because people are not going to stay in this situation forever. So thank you very much.
So, have a seat. Thank you. Thank you very much for this comprehensive overview and the optimism that you ended up with. Delighted to see a majority of students here, and we have 32 minutes. So what I will do is, instead of going with the list of questions that I have for you, I'll ask only one question and then open for questions from the floor. And my question is actually for the benefit of students here. And it's how did a white American girl with no Middle East background become an expert in Middle Eastern issues?
Yeah, so, well, thank you for calling me an expert on Middle Eastern issues. I appreciate that. I mean, basically, I took Middle East politics as a sophomore in college. My professor said, go to Egypt junior year abroad. And that's what I did. And I've been hooked ever since. And I've been going to the region ever since. I've been living, I think in total, if you add it all up, I probably lived in the region like 6 years or 6 years. So, and I go there constantly.
And you learned Arabic?
I learned Arabic, although please don't start interviewing me in Arabic because it's really getting rusty since I'm not able to spend time there. However, my plan is when my youngest child is out of the house, I'm going to go move in with a family somewhere that speaks absolutely no English in a country like Lebanon. I guess Syria is not possible right now. Somewhere in the Levant where I can be exposed to that dialect, maybe in the Ba'a or something, and then regain it.
Great. I wasn't trying to promote Middle Eastern studies. It's just, it's a curious issue I've been thinking about. So with this, please feel free to ask questions. Raise your hand.
I just want to mention also for the people who are listening or watching this online is that they can put questions as well in the question section and we can read from them.
And they have the chair moderating, so
yes.
They get priority.
Yes, they get priority.
Yes, Tom.
So this idea of political science, are there any experimental ways people might approach this with leaders in a way that they don't have to bargain their own power to invest in the private sector? Are there any ways that we've thought about approaching that?
About how you might bring about new political settlements? Yeah, I mean, this is the $1 million question. And I think if we look at the historical record, one way that this happens is through revolution, which doesn't always, by the way, go towards more democracy. So sometimes we think of, this sort of teleological march of history, but actually that's not always the way things work. So revolution is one way, but one thing we learned from the Arab uprisings is that you can have revolutions in the sense that rulers are overthrown and even new actual political systems start to get institutionalized, but they're fragile. And if you don't have an effective opposition, it's one thing to get out on the streets and mobilize, it's another thing to govern. And so if you don't have an effective opposition that's ready to take the reins of power, then it's very hard to have a transfer of power. And this is all kind of endogenous in that ruling elites know this. So that's why they target oppositions and weaken them, because they don't want to have effective oppositions. And that's why they pay off the most threatening potential components of elite social coalitions like security forces and economic elites and so forth. But historically, revolution is one way. Colleagues that have studied other contexts have talked about civil society mobilization in the longue durée. And so, we might be seeing shifts. I don't have a crystal ball. In Lebanon, you have an enormous amount of civil society activism, and people are really demoralized right now. But it seems to happen in waves and cycles, and once you've laid down some civil society infrastructure, it's kind of there to build upon. So I don't think there's a quick answer to this, and it's pretty apparent that for a variety of reasons, incumbent authorities do not want to do any kind of negotiated situation where they go ride off into the sunset and go live in Jeddah or Moscow and get to keep a chunk of the spoils in exchange for leaving and letting other people take the reins. So that doesn't seem to be a viable path. They're going to hold on to power as long as they can and burn the place down if they have to. So I think the only way this is going to happen is through repeated social mobilization, and it's got to be largely locally driven.
Could you say your name at the beginning?
Okay. My name is Ben. Thank you for your presentation. On a similar note, I'm curious, within the region or within kind of adjacent regions, like, are there any promising examples of nations or even more locally regions that we could look to in terms of how do we have this new political settlement, like positive examples of, okay, they did this right, at least in some ways, or is it mostly a story of like, this is yet to be completed?
I mean, these are really good questions, tough to answer. There definitely is like a historical record of democratization and redistribution in other parts of the world. And so one could learn from those lessons. I mean, there's particular historical specificities that I think might make it difficult at this juncture. And the fact that this is a region that's benefited from high levels of natural resource rents, but also geopolitical rents. So you haven't had a lot of external pressure for liberal opening, despite rhetoric. This is a very geopolitically important region. And so, for example, if you're familiar with the work of Stephen Levitsky and Luke and Wei, they've made the argument that one path to democratization has been through linkage and leverage, where social movements and opposition groups and civil society activists are supported by external leverage and linkages to foreign donors and actors. This is not a region that's benefiting from that. This is a region that has, the West has basically decided we're not going to push any kind of opening here. It's too geopolitically sensitive. So I think that's certainly part of the story. I don't know that I would say that is the entire explanation for why we see this set of arrangements, but I think it's part of the story. It's possible that as indigenous groups organize more and more and demand change and develop linkages and can somehow overcome these geopolitical rents and strategic interests, that we can see some change. It certainly happened in many other regions, and many other places that have been firmly authoritarian are not. We are, of course, living in a moment of democratic backsliding. So again, we don't have a teleological march in history, and in this country, which is arguably one of the more consolidated democracies in the world, we're seeing serious threat to democracy. So I think we all, as citizens, if we care about democracy and the things that democracy theoretically can bring us, not just democracy as an abstract set of institutions, but voice, accountability, perhaps some redistribution and so forth, we all have to be vigilant about it. So I think, there's no sort of single answer here, but I think some combination of indigenous civil society mobilizing and external backing for them is probably going to be critical to the story.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Well, that was kind of my question, but I wanted to ask you specifically if you had an opinion on Oman, because I didn't really see it included in those countries, and what you thought of, because it does feel like a little bit different, but...
Yeah, I mean, I must say that I know relatively little about Oman, and there's virtually no social scientists that work on Oman. It's like this layering gap of research. I've actually been to Oman. It's quite a beautiful country. I mean, it's an interesting country in that it's in the Gulf and is not a super high GDP per capita country. It's not like a Kuwait or a Qatar or an Emirates. It doesn't have the scale of resources. It's also played a more neutral role vis-a-vis Iran and has tried to kind of maintain a role as a channel to Iran. And they had a relatively peaceful transition from one ruler to another several years ago. But it doesn't figure quite a bit in sort of discussions of where things are going. They did experience some protests, but not a sort of large-scale array of protests. They don't seem to, at least from what has been reported, have as much opposition as, say, Saudi Arabia has experienced. But certainly there are opposition groups there.
All right. I think you had your hand up.
Yes.
Hi. My name's Sophia. I'm a senior and government major. I'm wondering, as the U.S. pivots away from the Middle East towards East Asia, and also like corruption, human rights abuses, and conflict are kind of disincentivizing private sector investment in the region from Europe and the U.S. How open are Middle Eastern governments to investment from actors like China or like India's also nearby? And in the long term, like the charts you showed showing the dynamic between like trusting government and democracy and development, like, and the erosion of the social contract. Like, what is the long-term play if these investments are coming in from these other actors, and could it actually lead to less repression in the future?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I mean, excellent set of questions. And it's interesting, this pivot to Asia and away from the Middle East. I think they haven't quite succeeded in pivoting away from the Middle East. They can't quite pull that off. And ironically, part of the reason is precisely because of China. Because the minute they see China moving in, the United States administration, there are some elements that say, okay, we can't abandon things. And, you now have all this furious negotiating going on with Saudi Arabia about the potential for normalization with Israel, and what is the United States going to give in exchange for that. And I think looming in the background is definitely China getting more involved in the region, which makes the United States pivot a little bit back to the region. So I don't think it's been a successful endeavor to pivot away entirely for precisely that reason. And China absolutely has been increasing investments through the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth in the Middle East. I'm finding more and more Chinese students and experts contacting me about the government and academic institutions really want to build up knowledge on the Middle East and invest in Middle East studies. They're sending more students to study Middle East studies. So this really is reflected in educational trends as well in China. And it's a very different style of investment, as you say. There's no pretense of, quid pro quo of democracy or human rights improvements in exchange for investment or aid. And we can be cynical about the degree to which the United States actually cared about democracy or human rights. I think there's a very strong argument to say that wasn't at the forefront of American foreign policy agendas and hasn't been. But nonetheless, there are these trappings that come with American aid, and none of this is coming with Chinese investment. In fact, they don't want to hear about that. So that's a very different experience. There's a lot of complaints about Chinese investment as well. Often what I hear is that it disproportionately benefits Chinese labor, and profits go back to China, and there's very little technology transfer or investment spin-offs in the recipient countries. So it's not clear that that's going to suddenly make the world a fan of China either. But it certainly, I think, captures the attention of the United States and, refocuses the United States on the Gulf in particular. And China, of course, one of the main reasons they're interested in this region is natural resources and access to natural resources. So the Gulf is of particular interest.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rishi. I'm a freshman, probably studying government.
Just helps with the recording.
Hi, I'm Rishi. I'm a freshman, probably studying government. My question was regarding the Saudi Arabia-Israel normalization talks, and I was wondering if you think this could have potential knock-on effects on Israel's relations with the rest of the countries in the Middle East, and could we potentially see trade negotiations between these countries, and if this can potentially revitalize economies within the Middle East?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the possibly have some trade benefits. You know, the fact of the matter is there's been kind of relations already under the radar. So this is kind of formalizing things that already were happening even before the formal announcements of these normalization relationships. So I think for some economies, it might be helpful technology transfer, possibly for the Gulf countries in particular. You know, I haven't seen much sort of prognosis about the potential sort of boom effects of these arrangements. I haven't seen a lot of talk about this spurring major investment. So that's not something I've heard talked about. I mean, it's controversial because there's a disjuncture between government and popular sentiment in many of the countries that are signing these agreements. So I think that is a potential cause for instability. But in terms of projections about massive growth as a result of these arrangements, I haven't seen much on that. I don't know if you have thoughts on that. What analyses are you seeing on the potential?
I actually see a number of colleagues who work on these issues in the whole, so I'm reluctant to. Maybe they would like to chip in.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So Izzadeen expects me to, Bernay Avishai. Izzadeen expects me to talk about this, but I'm actually curious about something else, which has to do with the phrase private sector. And you were really getting at it toward the end. I cannot think of an area of the world which has experienced significant and successful eras of economic growth where there hasn't been a tremendous amount of foreign direct private investment. Foreign direct investment. Leave aside the question of democracy for a second. I'm just talking about management skills, intellectual capital. You call it technology transfer, but it's broader than that. I mean, including Israel, by the way, maybe archetypally Israel, which has experienced a tremendous amount of economic growth precisely because of direct foreign investment and the intellectual capital that comes with it, a window onto customers, a window onto suppliers, a window onto technology, with all kinds of entrepreneurial spin-offs, which would have been inconceivable without that direct foreign investment. And when you have put on the various graphs, you know, public sector investment in infrastructure, I was wondering all along how much of that infrastructure was really meant either to, or public sector investment, how much of that was really meant to create infrastructure for direct foreign investment so that, you know, UPS can pick up and drop off, that kind of thing. And also qualify people through education to actually work in these kinds of industries and benefit from the kinds of knowledge that they gain, engineering and otherwise, managerial engineering and so on, owing to that direct investment.
I mean, I can't give you sort of a breakdown there, but in general, I think one thing we know about this region is attracted very low levels of foreign direct investment.
Right, so
why? That's the problem.
That's really the question. Why?
Yeah. I mean, the Gulf is the region that has attracted the most, but because of oil and gas, predominantly some services, more and more, but a lot of it is like refining and sort of spin-off upstream, downstream. So the rest of the world, why? I think partly these are, and you have to look at politics here, I think property rights are not secure. So I think it's not an attractive prospect to bring your capital here. So property rights, cronyism that disproportionately funnels access to opportunities to well-connected elites, that makes it pretty unattractive to invest. Property rights, not to say that the Gulf countries are these paragons of good governance, but property rights for foreign investors have been relatively more secure in those parts. And that's reflected in the kind of doing business surveys, which I realize have their problems, but you know, property rights by and large, if you're a foreign investor, are more secure in the Gulf countries like the Emirates or Qatar or whatever it might be. But they're just not as secure for both domestic and international investors in the rest of the region. And what you've seen a lot in, say, the Tunisias, I know when I used to live in Tunisia years ago, you know, Carrefour would come in and want to open up supermarkets, but they'd always have to open up with like Leila Trabelsi's family or Benazi's family. They always had to cut a deal with some well-connected elite and not just go in for the pure return of the investment. So I think that's a big part of the story. And then there's, you know, certainly port infrastructure and, you know, labor costs and things like that play into the picture as well. And for manufacturers, you know, most Middle Eastern countries have not taken off in manufacturers. When they did, it was like quick turnaround and not cheap, low value added goods. It was sort of like the, you know, quick turnaround, higher value added goods, and they don't have booming markets in that. Mostly the stuff is being sourced elsewhere. So I think, you know, it's a combination of input costs and also just the regulatory environment or lack thereof.
Sorry.
I have two questions that are kind of interconnected. I mean, one is about the idea of the social contract or the pact. You said, I like to use the word pact. And I'm thinking national pact, and I'm thinking, you know, the idea of the nation as a project, but also as a liberal project that we've gotten used to study, see how it evolves, look at its educational infrastructure, look at its economy, you know, all the institutions that make it up. And from what you're describing and what we see is that the institutions are just crumbling in a lot of places in the region. And where they are not crumbling, you have basically, we're going to solve our problems through, you know, economic growth, and who needs democracy and who needs freedom of speech. So on the one hand, you have a model that is completely non-liberal in the way we understand it. That's not, and then another model where the actual institutions will make us no longer think of the state as, or the nation as some sort of ideal community that people identify with. So, I mean, so how do we kind of bring these two realities together, and should we kind of rethink also our categories of analysis to reflect on this part of the world in light of this? Because we still base many of our kind of values or epistemological frameworks on notions of the state and its institutions and an education as somehow bringing about some sort of democratic process that might improve conditions at all levels. So questions, reflection maybe?
Yeah, I mean, these are really great points. And, you know, when we look at the history of nation building, it's often wrapped up in an idea of a political community, a shared political community, which can be reinforced through some of the very programs I was talking about in the earlier decades after independence of, you know, building social infrastructure, social welfare. I think in the Lebanese case, actually, you know, I think of the jihadist moment in the late 50s, early 60s, where you had this president in this country that has 18, however you count it, recognized ethnicities and religions, This president said, we can engage in a nation-building project by building out the national infrastructure, by building out social programs and so forth. And so this was part of, moving away from the case of Lebanon, which is somewhat distinct from other cases in the region. This was part of the national project, the nation and state building project after independence for many of these countries. And it's become an empty vessel now. I think, there isn't a kind of idea of the national project. When I highlight repression, I think that's sort of taking the place of building a shared community, both morally and materially, in many of these countries. And I mean, if I were an opposition activist, I would start, with a language of national solidarity, of believing in a popular community and trying to build that way. I think people need emotional appeals as much as they need material inducements. And there isn't a sort of message of this in that's really resonated by opposition groups and ruling authorities. They have empty rhetoric, but they're not really supplying a kind of motivating vision that captures people. And I think it needs to be reinforced through the rhetoric and vision, but also through the state programs. I don't think one can go without the other. And I remember recently talking to some colleagues in Lebanon, which, as you all know, I'm sure is undergoing such a tremendous crisis, an economic crisis. It's hit rock bottom. The political elites basically think the crisis is over, that they've hit a new low equilibrium, and that's fine. We're done. We've hit a new equilibrium, so the crisis is over. Doesn't matter that it's like, in the basement instead of at the top. And so some of my colleagues in Lebanon have been saying, instead of thinking of these social assistance and cash transfer targeted programs, let's think about revitalizing the National Social Security Fund and think about how we might do that as a vehicle for trying to rebuild a shared national political community, and that would be like a policy instantiation of that. And so, they're calling to the IMF with its plan for Lebanon, which the politicians are never going to adopt anyway. They're never going to sign on to it. But it's important that they have a plan, that somebody present them with a plan. They're calling for the IMF to, advocate for these kinds of programs, to revitalize them. Rather than emphasizing constantly these targeted poverty alleviation programs, trying to build national institutions, invest in education. And if it's not going to be public education, invest in regulatory institutions that regulate the quality of education. I've actually done a fair amount of work with the Ministry of Public Health in Lebanon. And, they have almost no scope to do anything. Their budget is this big and it's entirely supplied by international organizations, especially at the primary healthcare level. And they've made some progress, very incremental progress in providing basic packages of services. And they're trying to build awareness of basic services as a right of citizenship and something that people should expect and demand from their governments. So I think these kinds of incremental projects are going to be very important. And people, opposition activists need to captivate people with a vision of national political community. It's not going to be easy.
I have time for one final question. Go ahead.
So my question specifically relates to a more diplomatic level and how upper middle powers, for example, can support opposition activists on the ground in their venture. Because in many cases, if we look throughout history, even regardless of how strong an opposition is, oftentimes they rely on support from other countries, other states, other organizations to succeed ultimately. Great example is bringing down apartheid in South Africa, the international sanctions campaign that went along with upheaval domestically. What can upper middle powers and great powers as well do to support these opposition movements, strengthen them, ensure that they can actually go to a critical mass to ensure that they do have an impact and ultimately there would be a benefit to the economy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's tough because what authoritarian rulers have done is essentially criminalize external support. And, you know, Soros has become a bad word. And so, and an excuse, you know, criminalizing the receipt of funds from foreign actors. So it's a delicate dance here. And, you know, you can be imprisoned. I think Egypt now has a law against this, if I'm not mistaken.
And they don't need a law.
And they don't need a law. Yeah, that's
It's a trivial issue.
Yeah, law is, you know, beside the point. So, yes. So it's a difficult, you know, issue, and it can be twisted and turned and criminalized and weaponized. And you know, certain external actors like the United States come in there with baggage because they're associated with intervention and you know, foreign policy moves that have infuriated populations in the region and so forth. So they come in with baggage. They're not the Scandinavian aid agencies, you know. So it's hard to see how to operate in this context, and it's not clear. There's a literature in political science on democracy promotion, and it doesn't. From my understanding of the literature, is it's very mixed results at best in terms of bringing about pro-democracy change and so forth. So it's hard. I mean, I think one. You know, perhaps the good thing, the best approach is to take more of the kind of neutral aid agency approach, and to try to you know, work on supporting opposition actors with skills building and sort of international networks that give them sort of behind the scene access to resources. But I think it's going to be really complicated given the repressive environment and the targeting of civil society organizations in particular.
All right, that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much for coming and for your talk. And thank you again, the Dickey Center, for the support, the government department, Middle East Studies, and Political Economy Project all came together and kind of made this possible. Thank you again for taking the time, and thank you everybody for coming.